Okay, welcome back. Now we have some highlights again. So in the afternoon, Gil Sims will talk about debt deficits and inflation. And of course, we know that inflation is the hot topic these days, and we will learn all about it, whether the huge deficits were causing the inflation or not. Chris, the floor is yours.
How long do I have?
1 hour.
1 hour, okay, including questions. Okay, this is not going to tell you what's causing inflation or what's going to happen to inflation. This is a kind of a strange little theoretical model that I wrote down and tried to solve. Actually, I had various versions of it that I tried to solve, trying to understand Blanchard. In his presidential address in 2019, he observed something that people had observed before, that if government debt pays a lower rate of return than the growth rate of the economy, you can run deficits in debt. You can increase debt and then never have to tax to pay it off, but the debt will automatically shrink relative to GDP, which seems like it's, even though you don't put that in a formal model, it seems sort of obvious that that must lead to a sustainable equilibrium. And it seemed to me that there must be some cost of trying to do that, but I wasn't sure how to model that. So there is a trade-off, and the simple way to see that there has to be some kind of trade-off is with just looking at what people call the intertemporal budget constraint. The intertemporal budget constraint is not really a constraint on the government. The constraint on the government is the current time budget identity. It says if you tax less than you spend, you're financing the rest of it with some kind of government liability. That's a constraint on the government. You take that government budget constraint and integrate it forward, and you get what people call the intertemporal government budget constraint. But that's a combination of the real constraint, which is the contemporaneous one, with an equilibrium condition that comes from private sector behavior, the transversality condition. In order to solve forward and get the usual budget constraint and no remainder term on the end, you have to add the condition, if beta is the discount rate in a non-stochastic model, the usual transversality condition is e to the minus beta t times the real value of private sector assets has to go to 0, where beta is the private sector discount rate. To get that thing, which gives you the unique forward solution, to get that, you need the private sector transversality condition, which is a condition of optimization for the private sector. It's not something that is directly a constraint on the government. It has to hold in equilibrium, and that, but the government is not responsible for making it hold. The private sector behavior will make it hold, given what the government does. So, if you take the government budget constraint and the private sector transversality condition, you don't get that the current real value of the debt is the discounted present value of future primary surpluses. That's the standard conclusion from a very simple fiscal theory model, that the real value of the debt is the discounted present value of future primary surpluses. Because you don't get that if you discount at the government bond interest rate, which people sometimes do, but that's not, you can't derive that equation. If the government bond interest rate is different from beta, the private sector discount rate, it's not a constraint on the government. It's not a condition of optimality of the private sector that the current real value of the debt is the discounted present value of future primary surpluses with discounting at the rate on government debt. Another way to put that is there's no conflict with the transversality condition in a static model if wealth grows exponentially at a rate lower than beta. And if the government debt is paying less than beta, less than the private sector discount rate, then you can have explosion of the debt at e to the RT, where R is the rate on government debt, and it doesn't doesn't in general violate a transversality condition. So that's an equation you can derive by adding the assumption that e to the minus RT BT goes to 0, but that assumption comes from nowhere. It's not a condition of private sector optimization. But when you when you go forward, you solve forward using beta as the discount rate, you get an extra term. On this slide, revenue minus spending is the primary surplus. That is, it's removing the interest spending from spending. So it's spending other than interest payments. And the term called seigniorage is the gap between what the government would be having to pay on the debt if it had carried interest at the rate beta and the rate that it actually has to pay, which is less. So this seigniorage term is a fiscal resource. It depends on how much debt is outstanding. It depends on what the gap is between the interest rate on debt and the interest rate on private sector securities, or the discount rate. And changing the level of debt or changing the rate of growth of debt will, in general, you expect it to affect the gap between the rate of return on private and public securities, or in these simple models, just the gap between the rate of return on government debt and the private sector discount rate beta. So that's the basic intuition for why there has to be a trade-off. Seigniorage is a fiscal resource, or the gap is a fiscal resource. If you try to push out lots of government debt that people don't really need, you're going to shrink the convenience yield on it and eventually reduce this seigniorage term. So that's why it's worthwhile looking at a formal model where we can get all this pinned down. The formal model I'm going to write down is very simple, very unrealistic, so it's a little hard to turn it into quantitative intuition, but it's still worth doing, I think. The Friedman rule. Friedman argued that since fiat money can be produced at zero cost, it must be optimal to expand the amount of money outstanding until the real return on money matches the return on other assets. The message is you should saturate the demand for money. And he put that forward as a very general proposition, and it has appeal. He was thinking about a model where there was money that paid no interest and government debt that carried no liquidity or convenience yield premium. And his argument actually, if you think, what I'm going to show you is a model in which government debt pays interest, has a convenience yield, and there is no money. There's only one kind of government asset. The only excuse for doing that is that the model is hard enough to solve with one kind of government liability. And also, since we've been through a long period where the interest rate on interest-bearing government bonds was essentially zero, just as it is on fiat money, the notion of working off a sharp distinction between zero interest paying fiat money and other kinds of interest-bearing government debt didn't seem like a good strategy. So the model I'm going to look at with you is one in which there's just one kind of government liability. It carries a convenience yield. It's formally identical to models with money paying zero interest rate, so long as there's no other government debt that has a convenience yield. So Friedman's argument, as when you translate it into the mathematics of the model I'm going to show you, just says the optimal policy is to push out increase real debt until the gap, the convenience yield on real debt has disappeared. That's Friedman's rules. Now, there is an old literature, which I actually discovered after I'd done this whole model, in which people didn't make a distinction between the rate on government debt, interest-bearing government debt, and private sector debt. So those two things were the same sort of asset from the point of view of the private sector, and in which there was non-interest-bearing money. So the article I found after I had done this, worked out this model, is by Calvo. I'd finished the model, and you'll see at the end an important result is that there's a tremendous incentive to violate time consistency in this setup. So I typed into Google time consistency monetary policy, and Calvo's article back in the 70s. This was right after the first articles that began to discuss time inconsistency and its implications for monetary policy. Calvo did a model which is very close to the model I'm going to show you here, but it just has money, M, paying no interest. And it develops the intuition that comes from this little version of the government budget constraint. If you have only money, no interest-bearing debt, then there's no distinction between monetary and fiscal policy. The only way you can increase the money supply is give some money to people. That's transfers, or you're purchasing something, that's spending. The only way you can shrink the money supply is to tell people you have to give me some of it. That's taxation. So when there's only one kind of government liability, it's M, fiscal and monetary policy are the same thing. There's no distinction. And here, the government budget constraint in this simple framework is minus m dot over p equals tau, where tau is the flow rate of government net. Minus m dot is government surpluses. And that's the same thing as m dot over m times m over p. In steady state equilibrium, at least m dot over m is going to match p dot over p. So this is inflation times real balances. It's a familiar thing that says seigniorage on money. If you're steadily expanding m, you are getting revenue from that. And if the alternative is taxation, and the taxation is distorting, it's not so obvious that you want to follow the Friedman rule. Friedman rule in this kind of in a static model like this would say you've got to make the rate of return on money match the private discount rate. The only way to do that is to deflate, make the real value of money grow at the private sector discount rate. In order to deflate in this setup, looks like you have to tax. And if the only tax available is a distorting tax, it's not so clear that going all the way to the Friedman rule and deflating at the rate beta makes sense. So that's another way, that's a reason to go to a complete equilibrium model. And once you see this, you realize that this notion of whether the paradox that Blanchard was looking at seemed to require growth, real growth, and that gave you the chance to finance stuff for free, but only so long as the rate of return on on government debt was below the growth rate, which hasn't come up in our discussion so far. And it's not really essential, as we'll see. The real question is, do you want to go all the way to the Friedman rule? And if not, why not? What are the costs of doing that? So there were two papers that I was aware of as I started on this. One by Woodford. Actually, the first one was pointed out to me by Ricardo Lagos, who hates all this stuff. Because he's a very purist, let's motivate money from micro foundations, and this model doesn't do that at all. But he pointed out to me that many people think that Chari and Kehoe settled this question of the Friedman rule by proving that it's always optimal to follow the Friedman rule so long as you have money in the utility function and it enters in a homothetic way. So, and they have a paper which claims to show that. Then there's a paper by Woodford in the Handbook of Monetary Economics in which he discusses the optimum quantity of money. He looks only at steady states of a model that's a generalization of the one we're going to look at. And actually the one we're looking at is a special case of the one Chari and Kehoe look at also. Woodford observed that it was quite possible to, in some versions of the general model he looks at, to derive the result that the optimal steady state does involve violating the Friedman rule, that you want to use seigniorage as a fiscal resource in steady state. But he looked only at steady state. He looked only at models where, and because he looked only at steady state, whereas Chari and Kehoe were looking at full Ramsey optima, starting from time zero and not requiring stationarity. Chari and Kehoe say, well, the reason Woodford got his results is that he looks only at steady states, and we're looking at the full optimum. And then Calvo shows in a model that's pretty close. It's very close to the one we're going to look at. It differs in that he models the costs of taxation by just saying that real output is a function of the level of taxation, and it's concave, so there's an optimum. If you tax more than that, or even subsidize more than that, you get lower output. So that the fiscal costs of taxation are separable from production of, they enter the model separately. And in general, it's only a hairline special case. The model with the fiscal cost modeled separately actually satisfies the homotheticity requirement that Chari and Kehoe say is critical. So we have these three papers. And what Calvo shows is that in his model, doing the full Ramsey equilibrium, you go to a steady state in which you converge to a steady state, and you don't actually reach it, but you head toward a steady state in which seigniorage revenue is positive. It's not the Friedman rule. Though he didn't emphasize it, there's policy at the beginning is different from the steady state. And that's a result we're going to get to. So the net contribution of this paper is, like Calvo and Chari and Kehoe, it does the full Ramsey thing. Like Chari and Kehoe, it has homotheticity. And the result is that basically Calvo is right. It didn't really matter that much that he used the separability. The homotheticity is, I think, not even important, actually. and we'll discuss why. I've already discussed this. So it may be worth repeating here. In our model, we verify Calvo's conclusion that a benevolent planner constrained to rely on distorting taxes, but able to credibly commit to the path of future policy, chooses to have high initial inflation and low taxes, and does not converge to a steady state in which the Friedman rule holds. So here's the model. It's going to be continuous time. When I present this in Minnesota, they say, well, we won't really understand it until you convert it to discrete time. I just think it actually is clearer. If you know how to do differential equations, it is clearer for these issues in continuous time. There's only one input in production, that's labor, and just one tax, which is a proportional tax on labor, and just one kind of government liability. It's nominal duration 0. We're going to allow it to pay interest or not. It actually turns out in this very frictionless model, nothing changes when you change the time path of the nominal interest rate except the time path of inflation. So that most of the time we're dealing with a version of the model in which the nominal interest rate is tossed aside as a recursive add-on. And we're going to assume that government purchase or expropriation of private sector assets is not possible. Now that turns out to be very important. Essentially the way, so to give away the result, the way Chari and Kehoe get their result is by making assumptions about time 0 that they don't emphasize when they emphasize the homotheticity as key to their result. But actually the real key to the result is that they assume that the government at time 0 is unconstrained in any way. If it has government debt, it can simply repudiate it and issue new government debt that's a senior claim on resources. And I'm going to assume they can't do that. The way that what happens in the Chari-Kehoe setup is the optimal thing to do is, since money provides services, you would like to have, or government debt provides services, you would like to have a certain amount of it around. There is an optimal amount. At time 0, you can issue money and use it to buy private sector assets that pay an interest rate of beta. So at time 0, you start out with if you start out with no assets, the government, you issue bonds paying a lower interest rate than beta, lower real rate than beta, use them to buy private sector's assets that pay beta, and you now are set up so that if the interest rate is 0, for example, to implement the Friedman rule, you need to tax a proportion beta of the real balances every period to create the deflation. But you don't need to tax in the Chari-Kehoe setup because you have these private sector assets you've bought that are paying exactly beta, and the value of your money outstanding and your private sector assets matches. If you didn't do anything, the private sector assets would grow because they're paying a positive real rate and money is paying no rate. But you just take the interest returns on your private sector issued assets and use them to use them as a fiscal resource, so you don't have to tax in order to reduce the money supply. Another way to put it is you get the return on the private sector assets, you trade that to the private sector for a fraction of their money balances. And so the money balances shrink, the price level grows, you've hit the Friedman rule. And even though there's only one tax and it's distorting, doesn't matter because you don't have to use it at all. So here's the model. The paper that goes with this has more discussion of the initial conditions. I think I have I may have a slide that discusses that. Yeah.
So regarding this assumption, do you make this because you think it's not realistic that not enough private sector assets out there, or is that the reason that there is something you need to assume for the government?
This is clearly an assumption, and governments do acquire assets. Perhaps surprising thing is that most U.S. state governments are net creditors because they have pension programs. And they have bureaucrats who buy private sector assets to provide a return in those pension programs. So it's certainly possible for the government to acquire private sector assets. But with those pension programs, they're not a huge thing, and there's always worry about political favoritism, inefficient investment, and so on. If you had such a thing on the scale of the entire convenience yield-bearing U.S. government debt, you would have the government's fingers in the economy everywhere. So it's certainly not realistic to say the government can never never own anything, own any assets, but it's like the assumption of a zero lower bound on the interest rate. You can go below zero, but things get very dicey if you do that. And it starts to depend on details and things we usually leave out of models, why we don't really want to go to very far in negative interest rates. And the same here, government can acquire private sector assets, but to do it, especially the way that Char and Kehoe assume, which involves repudiating existing debt first, and then buying private sector asset with liabilities you're issuing of a type you've just defaulted on.
Is that not a bit separate? I mean, they probably repudiate because they want zero distortionary taxes, right?
Right.
You would, even if you can't do that, you would but you could
buy yes.
assets, you would still implement a Friedman rule. No, you have distortionary taxes, but
right. So as soon as you can back the entire amount of convenience yield providing government debt with private sector assets that pay more with certainty, you're okay, yeah. Or it paid the beta, the rate beta. Now this is all in a model with no uncertainty about fiscal policy or government spending or private sector shocks or anything like that. So things would get much more complicated once you recognize that private sector assets don't just pay beta with probability 1 every instant. And I haven't tried to get into that. I should add there's one other very relevant paper that I became aware of only very recently when Angeleto sent it to me. He has a paper. It's on exactly this. It's actually most of the paper is dealing with exactly Calvo's model, except that he doesn't call it M. Half the paper is devoted to showing that a model like this one, which looks extremely simple, but can be given a micro foundation in about half a dozen ways. So you shouldn't be embarrassed about looking at this model. So that's a reason to read Angeleto's. He differs in that he does not. He takes the initial real value of the debt as a state. In other words, assumes the government cannot inflate away any debt at the initial date, which gives him a much richer class of solutions, and it gets much more complicated. Here I'm going to assume that the government can inflate initially and inflates away enough of the debt inflates or deflates enough so that the amount of nominal debt outstanding, so that if there are both interest-bearing forms of debt that don't pay any convenience yield and convenience yield debt, that at the initial date you inflate enough so that nobody wants to hold anything except the convenience yield debt. So it's a conclusion that there's no other kind of government debt. It's not optimal to have other kinds of government debt because you have to tax for it. So here's there's an objective function, a private sector representative agent, maximizes the discounted present value of log C, which is consumption, minus L, which is labor input. Consumption and output are the same thing. There's no investment. The private sector budget constraint is consumption times 1 plus gamma V, where V is consumption velocity. It's the ratio of consumption to real debt. So C times 1 plus gamma V is how much the private agent is spending on consumption goods. His utility depends only on C. So the goods he gets to consume are C, and the amount of spending on them is C times 1 plus gamma V. So gamma V is the proportion of spending on consumption goods that is absorbed by transactions costs or inconvenience yield, inconvenience. B is nominal debt. B dot over P is the real value of current issuance of nominal debt. Tau is the tax rate on labor. So on the right-hand side are resources of the private agent, which are 1 minus tau times L plus, and here it's implicit that that L turns into C 1 for 1, except for the taxation. So there's a linear technology. And then the private agent holds government debt on which he or she earns RB over P. So R is the nominal rate of return on government debt. So the private sector first order conditions, I won't go through them one by one. It makes it easy here that the L first order condition gives you an easy solution for the Lagrange multiplier as a function of one of the things we're going to treat as a parameter, tau. And we impose the transversality condition that says that lambda, the multiplier on the constraint times real debt times e to the minus beta t has to go to 0. You can solve those first order conditions to eliminate lambda, and you get these two equations, which characterize private sector behavior. Now we're going to be looking at a government that optimizes taking private sector behavior as given. So those two equations are, from the government's point of view, constraints. Then there's a social resource constraint that you can get from the government budget constraint and the private sector constraint, or we'll just use these two separately and ignore the private sector government budget constraint. But this says that spending on consumption plus government spending, G, which we're going to hold fixed at some positive, we can look at zero spending cases too, that has to equal production, L, and the government budget constraint, which is saying that we have to finance government spending plus interest payments either by taxation or debt issue. So if we rearrange the government budget constraint so that the beta appears in it, while at the same time writing it in terms of real debt, little b, which is big B over P, we get this equation in the middle. we'll call the gap between the discount rate and the return on government debt seigniorage. So that's not really, it's not the same thing as some other definitions of seigniorage. In steady state, it often comes out that all the definitions of seigniorage are the same. We're just going to call it seigniorage. It's the gap between beta and the rate of return on government debt. Is R the real return? Yeah. R is the real return, I guess. Anyway, then you can solve forward and you get this government budget constraint that says, this is a version of what I had up on one of the first slides. It's discounted present value of revenues from taxation plus seigniorage minus government spending. So the first thing I did with this model was just look at optimal steady states because it's pretty easy algebra to solve for the steady state for a given setting of G and tau and beta. So I just I solved that analytically and then just numerically searched for the utility in steady state and found that the amount of revenue raised by seigniorage is very small in anything that looks remotely realistic. You have to, in this model, you have to push G up to near its maximum possible value in order to get revenue actually being raised by seigniorage. In fact, the equilibrium in most realistic cases involves taxing more than you need to cover G in order that you can push you can keep real debt high enough so that the gap between the convenience yield is small. Also, in this model, because it's flex price, there's no transition path. The real debt is not a state variable for the government. Nominal debt is. But by announcing credibly its plans for future fiscal policy and the interest rate, the government determines the current price level. So the government can set the price level anywhere it wants, and so no matter what nominal debt you come into time zero with, the government can make real debt anything it likes. So if you change the parameters, if you're in a steady state and change the parameters to go to and the government then and the government changes parameters so as to make the steady state different. At the instant the parameters change, the economy jumps to the new steady state. There's no transition path. And the results, the steady state equilibrium exists when this condition 1 plus tau greater than 2G holds. G can't, it turns out there's no way to make G greater than 1 in this framework. In steady state. So if this is not the same thing as tau greater than G. It's 1 plus tau greater than G, so it's a little weaker condition than tau greater than G. In other words, there can be a steady state with tau less than G. So here's some example numerical solutions. This first set is with no government spending, so there's no need for taxation. Tau is the tax rate on labor. You see that the optimal steady state has positive taxation. That's because it's a good idea to try to keep the rate of return on government bonds close to beta. See, where do we see that? Yeah, the discount rate is 2%. Oh no, R is 0.02. Yeah, it's I is the nominal rate, it's 0.02, right. So that 2% inflation is what you would get if the real rate on money was 0. And this P dot over P, the inflation rate, is measuring the convenience yield. It's measuring the gap between the yield on government bonds and beta. So the inflation rate is very close to 0 in this steady state. Debt is quite large. Gamma is the transactions costs or convenience yield, and the next slide is the one that gives looks closest to reality. And on that one, gamma equals 0.01 looks realistic. But here you see that it's optimal to have large ratios of B to Y, lots of debt, because that's the Friedman rule. You want to saturate the demand for the convenience yield on government debt. So the optimal thing to do is to make debt big, so that and drive down the convenience yield on debt. But notice that in steady state, to make debt big, you don't run a lot of deficits to make debt big. Once you get there, you've got to cover the interest on it. So you have to have taxation. You have to have taxation in order to make debt big. And that's why we're getting positive taxation here, even though there's no need for any taxation. This is the one. The second line here is closest to something that looks like where we are today. You get debt to income 0.83. The solution, if you had no distortions, no costs, no transactions costs or convenience yield, and lump sum taxes, is L equals 1. So we're driven not very far from L equals 1 in these optimal steady state solutions. And P dot over P here with now G, 25% of L, which is L is output, is still, you're still very close to the Friedman rule. And this shows what happens if you push G to 0.8, which is pretty close to the highest it can be. In other words, government spending is 80% of total product. Then you start to get positive inflation. You want to use the seigniorage, but the seigniorage is not a big part of total revenue even here. So I'm going to skip this comparing steady states, because the most dramatic thing is what happens when we move out of this assumption of a steady state. Now, a steady state here requires commitment, because it's the government has to announce that it's keeping tau and G constant, and people have to believe that. And there is, you can look at first order conditions, there is a temptation to deviate. It's not optimal to stay in the steady state. If the government, we're assuming the government can commit and be believed. If the government can commit and be believed, no matter what it does, it's not optimal to stay in the steady state, as we'll see. So the steady state requires ability to commit. And once you recognize that, you think, well, why don't we just ask what happens if they really exploit that ability to commit and start at time 0, announce a path for policy, and stick to it. So we're going to look at what happens if the planner has the same objective function as the private agent. Now, if there really were one representative, infinitely lived agent, this would be a reasonable thing to do. If this model is a stand-in for an overlapping generations model where a large part of the discounting is coming because private sector discounting is greater than, or it reflects the probability of death, so that individuals discount more than would a government that values all individuals at all dates the same. Then you would get something else. Then you would go to the steady state. If there were overlapping generations and the government cares about all generations equally, the optimal policy, I think, would be to go to the steady state. And certainly would not involve discounting. You wouldn't discount future utilities. But we're going to look at what happens assuming that the planner discounts at the same rate as the private agent, and that's the same assumption that Calvo made. So the technicalities of how I did it is given future tau and B can be boiled down to a single differential equation expressing V dot as a function of V and tau. The planner's problems, I think it's tau, given current and future tau and V, that should be. We get a single differential equation in V, that determines V dot, the rate of growth of that consumption velocity. The planner's problem then maximizes the agent's objective function, taking that differential equation as the state equation and tau as the control variable. And the planner with full commitment power can choose the initial value